Welcome everyone, back to another panel at Illusion HorrorCon 2023 with another amazing set of guests. This time we have Graeme Patrick, John Hook, Newman, Scott Dorward and Jason Fryer, all fantastic hosts from various locations that you probably know. And today we will talk about how to design a compelling villain and monsters for your horror RPG. If you have any questions for the panelists throughout, please enter them at our YouTube channel, and we'll make sure to convey as many of those to our panelists as we can. And with that, I want to ask everyone here at the table to give a brief introduction of who they are and what they do, and introduce themselves briefly. Graeme, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. I'm Graeme Patrick. I work with Eight Slade Nobody doing main arc and a few other things as well. I run RPG Nook, which is like a YouTube channel which breaks down scenarios. And recently I've been doing audio dramas as well for Rusty Quill and a podcast called Creepy Podcast as well on Bloody FM.
Fantastic. John Hook?
Good morning or afternoon. I'm John Hook. I'm a writer and podcaster. I was one of the founding members of the Miskatonic University podcast, and now I co-host the Modern Mythos podcast with Seth Skorkowski. And I'm primarily known for my Call of Cthulhu scenarios.
Fantastic. T.A. Newman.
I'm T.A. Newman. I'm the host of the Miskatonic Playhouse, where we take majoritively Miskatonic repository community content scenarios and we give them actual plays. We run them through. So if you're looking to play one, you can kind of get a sense of how, I would argue, how not to do it sometimes, but also how to do it other times. I'm also a writer, and I think that's about it today.
Fantastic. Scott Dorward.
Yeah, hi, I'm Scott. I've written a bit of stuff for Call of Cthulhu, and I'm one of the hosts of the Good Friends of Jackson Lies podcast, where we talk about Call of Cthulhu and other creepy stuff. And I'm on a number of actual play podcasts, including Eight Slade Nobody, How We Roll, and Grizzly Peaks Radio.
Fantastic. And Jason Fryer.
Hi, I'm Jason Fryer, writer, game designer, and general curmudgeon. I've been writing for Cult and Cult Divinity Lost for maybe the last 25 years, on and off, and other horror games. Currently on Lost Caravan, running a couple of actual plays for Cult Divinity Lost and other RPGs. So, looking forward to this discussion.
Fantastic. And to get the ball rolling, I want to ask into the round, what is the most memorable villain or monster that you recall when it comes to name a memorable antagonist when it comes to RPG systems?
Oh. For an RPG system, I think the most memorable antagonist has got to be Vlad, right? The Ravenloft guy, right?
Strahd.
Strahd. Yeah. Strahd. I was going to say Vlad von Strucker, but Vlad. Yeah. I mean, that cover, that Clyde Caldwell cover, was amazing and compelling, and just having the villain prominent like that, and he's a true villain. He's just not he's not a monster that the heroes are fighting on the cover. He was this brooding villain daring you to come in. I mean, he started it all, I think, as far as having really compelling villains in RPG.
I think, for me, if I'm thinking about the ones that influenced me in gaming, I'd have to go back to Nyarlathotep, particularly, obviously, from Masks of Nyarlathotep, but just generally in both gaming and fiction, because, well, obviously there's the whole thing that he's got all these masks and different aspects, so you can encounter him over and over again in different guises and perhaps not even realize it's the same entity, and perhaps more interestingly, each guise can have different motivations and perhaps even be in conflict with other masks. But also there's perhaps a bit of ambiguity to him. If you go back to the fiction, to the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, he's portrayed much more as a trickster spirit there, and perhaps not entirely antagonistic, or at least does perhaps perversely beneficial things sometimes, just in very antagonistic ways. And yeah, I think that kind of complexity and variability makes him a fantastic villain.
Anybody else?
I mean, the one that it started me off, I think, was Walter Corbett from the Haunted House, the classic Call of Cthulhu. It's just this, in many ways, it's an amorphous character that basically all he wants to do is just lie there in state, and anybody that comes into his house is kind of treading on his territory. It was like the first almost existential threat that I had encountered. And I mean, I was like 11 and reading this, and like, wow, this is beyond the typical orcs that I'm used to from D&D.
Yeah, I think I'll probably go with Norlithif as well. I mean, it's one of these characters which he can be ambiguous and be everywhere and anywhere as well. It's like one of the best uses of him, I think, was in Saturine Chalice, which is one of Matt Sanderson's stories, where he's a dinner guest, which just becomes an uncanny figure in the house, and he's just there gleefully, like, just, you know, he's there to watch almost rather than anything else, because he set up the situation for himself almost, which has trapped the players. It's things like that which really stick with the players, and you can play into it as a keeper more and more. Other than that, I really like just human antagonists more than the monsters, because you can do the same sort of thing with them, and they're always far more sort of complex than something that's unfathomable. Because if it's unfathomable, then a lot of times players will just go, well, it is unfathomable, so we can't really like ascertain what's going on here. Where you can really betray a player with a human character, because it's you. It's a mirror. There's like a concept called the mirror antagonist, which is basically just the flip side of the actual hero, and it's basically them trying to justify themselves to the actual main character, and even corrupting them to be or become the mirror themselves. And they're the best characters out there.
Just with Graeme saying that there about the human characters, the ones that are kind of touched by those cosmic sources, and I think Nyarlathotep is very, that's that's their MO, isn't it? Is kind of you and you and you, and there's this incredible network. And I think David, you actually, is when you ran it for me, the Ladybug Fly Away Home. There was there's the priest character. And the church, and it was like, because those characters, because of the way the story was written, and there was that fanaticism within them as well, but they were human, that made it scary. And what Graeme was saying there about them being, human, I think, because we can turn on the news and see how scary humans can be, that adds a certain kind of level to it. And I think because it's not the unpredictability, because I still remember to this day the first time as a player I accidentally called Cthulhu. I still remember the terror in that, but I think beyond the call, it probably would have been squishy brain moment, whereas the human encounter, it was an ongoing sense of, oh my God, I kind of can see how this can go horribly wrong in a number of ways. Real powerful stuff.
Did you misdial to accidentally call Cthulhu?
Press 9. I pressed 6.
Damn it. That was a mistake.
Yeah, Joe, actually, that was I was really lucky. It was a really lovely game, really long build up to it, and it didn't feel cheap or anything like that. It was a really sophisticated moment where I was presented with the opportunity, and I was actually trying to do something else, but knew that was a consequence, and the dice told a story. And it was I felt really rewarded by it. It didn't go very well, but I felt really rewarded by that part of the storytelling. So I think that was a big villain done well by that keeper at that time.
And now I want to write a story where somebody butt dials Cthulhu.
Oh, can I just touch upon something Graeme mentioned a few minutes back, though, with the idea of cosmic entities, or these vast, unknowable evils. And I mean, this isn't just Call of Cthulhu, this applies to Cult and all sorts of other games as well. But these things that operate hugely beyond human scale. For me, the most interesting antagonists in games like those aren't even the people who they've affected, but the people who think they can draw upon that power or use it, think they've got an understanding of it, and perhaps are trying to channel some of that power for their own ends. Those, I think, are particularly interesting antagonists because they operate at a human scale, but they're also potentially very dangerous because they are badly out of their depth. And there is ultimately nothing so dangerous as someone who doesn't know what they're doing and has access to a lot of dangerous power.
Yeah, I always like to have my antagonist just know enough to get it wrong, the correct amount.
Yes.
Sort of yeah.
Yeah, in fact, I was going to say, every one of those, if a human is going, I will be the one standing next to him in the aftermath, I'm like, right. In fact, the only person who I've ever believed would stand there in the aftermath is Wilbur Whately. He's the only one who's like, I will be there in the aftermath. And I'm like, that could happen, you know? Everybody else, I'm like, yeah, right. You're delusional.
Yeah, that self-delusion and, the true belief is absolutely terrifying. A true believer is one of the most terrifying concepts because they think that they are right no matter what. I'm going to be beside Cthulhu for the rest of eternity. How delusional are you? This thing doesn't care about you or even recognize you.
Still with delusion though, but just on a slight scale there. There's that really lovely thing with the villain. I really love this with a villain is when they think they're the good guy.
Mm-hmm.
And
exactly.
that delusion is a wonderful thing as well because a little bit like, and of course, when I mentioned it earlier before we started recording, smarter person in the room, Graeme talked about that mirror of the protagonist and the antagonist there. You've got that lovely like, no wait, I'm doing the right thing, which is a really brilliant thing to be able to present your players with.
Yeah, but I think they also don't have to be clever. One thing I'd highly recommend to anyone who wants to write interesting villains in any horror game is to read some Elmore Leonard. He's not a horror writer, he's a crime writer, but he was particularly gifted at writing antagonists who were incredibly stupid. Really, had no idea what they were doing, but just kind of blundered through bad situations, making things worse. And their stupidity and misunderstanding of the situation, their overconfidence that builds, is what makes them dangerous. And characters like that are absolute gold in games.
Yeah. There was an episode of Good Friends where you were talking about a book where whoever read it had a different interpretation. What was that again? It was like all. I can't remember. It was this year, but I can't remember what it was.
You did that one episode this year, where you talked about some stuff that was creepy.
Yeah.
Was it the Book of Ivon or something like that? I don't think it was. I'll come back to me, don't worry. Okay. I'll look for it.
Yeah. I need more of a prompt than that. I'm sorry. Yeah. I am old and my brain is fucked.
I think we covered a good ground, and I kind of want to build up on that. And when I ask you guys, what makes a compelling villain? What makes and breaks a villain in a horror RPG scenario? What are do's, what are don'ts?
Believable motivations.
Yeah. It boils down to the motivations and having, in an RPG when you're trying to write this so that the game master will understand it, you need to be able to hand the game master a set of bullet points saying this is the motivations and this is how the villain wants to the path they want to take to achieve these goals, and that if certain conflicts come up, maybe prioritize them. But the game master needs to be able to have an understanding of what does the villain want, what is the goal they're trying to achieve, and how do they want to get there, and push that, because that will create the conflict. That will be where heroes and villains are going to butt up against each other.
I think one of the greatest antagonists of all time is Julia from Hellraiser, and her motivation was just basically, there's a story when they were writing Hellraiser discussing the name or like the title. Clive Barker wanted something like the Sadomasochists from Hell or something like that.
Sadomasochists from Beyond, yeah.
And then he asked the crew, what title would you say? And this old woman goes, what a woman would do for a good fuck. And that's the actual core of the story, is that she just wants to get laid. So she's murdering all these people and sacrificing them to her old boyfriend. And that's a believable, it's actually a very believable and deep motivation. So,
but I think you can go beyond just even a sympathetic motivation and have antagonists who potentially want exactly the same thing as the player characters want, but it's just their methods that differ. I know Graeme played this game with me on Ain't Slade, the meat trade, which has, I think, one of my favourite antagonists that I've written, which is an organisation called the Ratcatchers, who are just this group of classic Call of Cthulhu investigators from the 1920s who have been around for 20 years. It's now the 1940s. And their specialty is they hunt ghouls under the City of London. They go down into the sewers and the tunnels under London, and they hunt ghouls, try to keep the ghoul population under control. And after 20 years of doing this, they've been driven mad, their numbers have been killed, they've had to resort to more and more extreme methods, to the point where when the player characters encounter them, they are paranoid, they are ruthless, they are vindictive, they will do absolutely anything to pursue their goals, which are the same goals as the player characters have. It's just they're willing to kill absolutely everything that gets in their way, and they are willing to, or at least they're very suspicious of the player characters because they've been infiltrated so many times that they just assume when they encounter other people who say that they're on their side, that they're actually ghouls in disguise and probably need to be killed.
Yeah, it's a great foreshadowing of what the players will become as well, sort of thing. And it's that mirror again, looking at yourself in the future, sort of thing. They're really good. Whenever Kenneth showed up, we just went, oh, this guy.
Is that like having that DJ mixing scales where you're playing with people's morals and ethics, sliding them up and down to kind of work out their experience has changed their slider where they are in terms of their morality and their ethics, what they're willing to do. But in reality, as you say, that really lovely foreshadowing of players, it's where you started and where you've become because of what you've experienced, which is that's a really cool thing to do. That's a really cool thing to do. Yeah.
Yeah, not only that, they were different as well. It's like we went to an girl called Nancy, and Nancy was very affable and nice to us, right up until the point where she wasn't. And
yes, and poisoned one of the player characters. Yes.
We were rude house guests, to be honest, but yeah.
Go ahead.
Power dynamics are probably something you need to be aware of when you're making villains to be compelling as well. Most often the good villains are the ones which are still in society and still adhere to some sort of social contract with the rest of the world, but they've stepped over the line a couple times. And at the start you need to make sure that the players are aware that these people are stepping over the line just enough to make them a bit sort of suspect, but not enough to break that social contract. But they have the power to do that, to cross that line somewhere, and then come back again and then maybe apologise. And building up goodwill with the players will make that even stronger because they're willing to forgive someone they like. So if you have a player character who is tagging along with an NPC and that NPC does something ruthless once, but they've had this sort of small encounters of good before that, that's stepping over the line of something ruthless. It's kind of like kicking the dog almost. It's the sort of point of no return. But they'll forgive it once. They might even forgive it again, and then they'll see themselves getting involved in it as well. So they're bringing them along. They're putting their hand over their shoulder, sort of thing, and bringing them into the pack. I remember a story about a guy who went to prison and he had no friends and all the rest of it, and he fell into company with like white nationalists and all that. And the reason why he did that, after trying to stay away from so long, they gave him a birthday card, and it's like, oh, this is a humanity sort of thing. And he had no one else, so he got involved with that. There's a book called I can't remember the title now. Damn it! Where yeah, I can't remember.
Not that book you're reading.
It's that one.
With letters in it and then
God damn.
sentences.
Yeah, that one. No, I can't remember what it's called. It's by he just died recently. The author.
Cormac
famous-
McCarthy.
Yes. Red Meridian or something.
Blood Meridian.
Blood
Meridian,
Meridian. That's the one. We got there in the end. Yeah, that's another one that's got an antagonist who just compels people with gaslighting and all these sort of like social engineering to turn people against each other. And it's probably the best villains are the ones which are do that gleefully and right in front of you, and you just don't notice because you're slowly boiling the frog.
There is that really lovely kind of like seductive element there, and I think that for me, that's when Graham's kind of saying about you'll forgive them this and you'll forgive them that, it's because you as the player, you've invested in them, and if it is as the keeper, if you've got the information in the book, as John was saying, if you've been given that detailed motivation and how they're going to go about things, but also perhaps the parameters of where they're going, and thinking about Scott's sliding scale of morality versus ethics there, if you can get that seduction right or that gaslighting right in balance with each other, it can create a really rewarding relationship between an evil villain and your player characters.
Yeah, it's something corporations actually do quite openly. They spend goodwill. They see it as an asset that they can spend against their customers to do something really horrible or cutthroat. But they'll know the customer will stay because they've built up that goodwill, and then they just get away with that one thing and slide it under the rug.
Yeah. I've heard about that investment, that kind of goodwill positive. They talk about it as like a bank of goodwill that you're investing in, and you've got so much money that you can afford to spend X amount of goodwill, which is quite horrific, but translates brilliantly to gameplay.
Does, yeah.
I think there's a very related type of antagonism which has got an interesting dynamic, which I've used in games a few times. It's quite a difficult thing to pull off, which is the antagonist who you come to realize is actually in the right. I mean, not just that they're, not like, say, the rat catchers where their goals are good, but their methods are horrible, but ones who are entirely reasonable. And what makes them antagonists is that for whatever reason, the player characters aren't. The goal that they're pursuing is a corrupt one, or their methods are terrible, or they've been misled, they've been gaslit into doing something terrible. And they come up against this group of antagonists who, they think are potentially the villains, who are actually, in any reasonable story, the good guys. And it does present that wonderful opportunity for the player characters to perhaps suddenly sit back and think, oh, hang on, are we the baddies?
Yeah, that could be really difficult to pull off. I could see that in game. Thanos was just an environmentalist, really. I mean, he's just trying to help the planet.
Yeah.
So,
in contrast, and speaking of Cormac, No Country for Old Men has quite possibly one of the best existential threats of all time. Anton is a primal force. That character is terrifying because he knows he is perfect in his certainty of what he is and what he's going to do. He has certain rules. And I mean, if you can watch that scene in the the gas station where he's doing the coin flip, and you can walk away without, not completely terrified, there is something wrong with you, because that scene is just pure tension, and it represents in Call of Cthulhu, it's kind of like the alien, the unknowable, that existential threat, those monsters. That's in Cthulhu in human form in many ways. That would be a perfect Nyarlathotep.
Yeah, sometimes that pure predatory antagonism is a fun thing to play with. So, moving aside from human motivations, or at least relatable motivations and sympathetic characters, just a purely predatory, unpleasant, horrific monster, human or otherwise. I mean, I've played Alien with John a number of times now, and I mean that, I think, to me is one of the one of the attractions of Alien as a setting, which is that the xenomorphs in that are just such pure predators. They can't be reasoned with. They don't have any motivations beyond biological imperatives, destruction, and terror. And yeah, I think that makes for a very powerful antagonist as well.
Very good bedfellows, aren't they? Having that primal alien antagonist, but then also having your corporate representative or your android, and then having the players or your protagonist, however we see it, balancing the, I suppose, lesser of two evils. Do I confront that? Do I confront that? Who do I trust? Who do I, that makes a very rich tapestry to be able to tell that story then, because you've got such conflicting, contrasting threats to deal with.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting point, because in Alien, because the xenomorphs do not have a political agenda or something that they're trying to do because they want to get rid of. I mean, they're just trying to survive, right? They're just doing their biological. The humans who want to see opportunity to create bioweapons or engineer something so that human faction can have an edge up on a different human faction, they come out as the villains. They fill the villain category more so than just being antagonists. That's an interesting dynamic there.
Burke is the perfect villain, basically. He is the stupid corporate that wants to do the stupid thing with the thing he doesn't understand. So everyone dies for him, basically.
My favorite part is when he thinks he has all the power to go, I can't authorize that.
Yeah.
Who are you? Yeah.
I guess with that covered, since we also what I want to talk about is also the aspect of how do you bring an antagonist or a memorable villain into a scenario, which for one, in a one-shot, which is significantly different, obviously, than to a campaign play. Do you have any suggestions or comments that you might want to give new GMs or young GMs?
I think if I jump in, I'll be quick, guys, I promise, because I want to listen to your wisdom. I think, David, you hit the nail on the head there. There is a significant difference, isn't there, between a one-shot where it might be that the villain is very not obvious, but they're prominent, and they're something that you can allow your players to get to relatively quickly in whatever capacity because they need to, because it's a one-shot, or at least understand about the villain. In a campaign, there's much more of, I suppose, what Graeme and Scott, what we were all talking about earlier, really, actually, John was talking about as well, that kind of, the seduction, the gaslighting, that long-term relationship that you evolve with the character. However you do that, I think one of the longest kind of campaign that I've run, that I've had so many players in and out of with Cult and Culpability, the fun of it is that they met the villains of the story through missives, essentially, as letters, and then meetings, and then they met at a public event, so they had to behave in a certain way. So there was a restriction as to how much they could get their hands on them, like intellectually as well as physically. And it was only as the story evolved, and I think the brilliant social restrictions that are presented within that Regency Cthulhu, that there was an expectation, there was a forced expectation. So as the story went on, they were able to get more to them. That's my hat in the ring, chaps. Over to you.
Yeah, I'm working on a short. I'm assuming it'll be a con length scenario, and so in thinking about and I really do think this will be a villain, not just a creature, not just a monster that they're fighting, but something more intelligent, something that they have to outwit, outthink, and confront. Is you need to be able to, in a game setting, present information to the players, and the seeds of information will serve a couple of things. It'll give introduction to the villain. It'll have bits of information on how that villain could be defeated. Right? It's you need to be able to start your investigation, start your clue collection, and just kind of get them on that path. Right? Here's the first breadcrumb, and then take it and find the others. I want. The villain I'm designing right now is a witch, right? Just because I recently rewatched the Autopsy of Jane Doe, and I thought that was amazing. And I was like, man, I really need to do this witch thing. And so, characters will be in an area that they now cannot get out of, and so defeat the witch to get out. And you just have to start by putting in information, introduce the villains so that the characters know the players know what they are going to be confronting against, and they have a goal to survive and defeat against that. If that makes sense. I feel like I'm rambling.
No, I get exactly what you mean there, and I think the important thing, particularly with a one-shot, is that from the outset, or very quickly, the players need to understand, not just the player characters, but specifically the players, need to understand what the nature of the problem that they're facing is, or at least what the immediate problem they're facing is. There may be a lot more complexity to it. And to some extent, the antagonists are wrapped up in that. The antagonists may be the face of that problem. They may be the shadowy powers behind the problem. They may be tangentially related to or supporting the problem. But whatever it is, the players have got to understand what that problem is and have a goal that they can address. And how they interact with the antagonists then depend on what role the antagonists play in that problem and at what point the player characters uncover that involvement. It may be a big climactic thing at the end. It may be quite early on, but the more important thing is that they know what it is that they've got to try to overcome in this 3-4 hour game.
Yeah, I mean, I have to totally agree that when you're doing a one shot, it is your plot points and the characters' interaction with that plot needs to be pretty lined out and pretty obvious almost right from the start. You've got to set your stakes. You don't need a very defined villain or a multi-layered villain. They just need to be a solid anchor for the characters to build off of. When I ran the last transmission of a few months ago, the antagonist was technically a primal force, Gaia, in cult, and it reflected back all the horrible things that were inside the player character. So they actually became the antagonist, and I just literally let the players torture themselves. And by the end of it, we had literally two player characters sacrificing another to become a god. They were the ones taking that action, and the antagonist was just basically that mirror. This is what you can be. Do you want to take that step?
That's actually a good point for a question from the audience, which kind of follows up on that bit. Is do we actually need a specific villain to make a satisfying scenario, or in other words, must the antagonist of a story always be labeled a villain?
No, absolutely not.
Not at all.
There's a trope called the looming threat, which is kind of these behind the scene characters like the Eye of Sauron and It and sort of thing, which I've never seen. But apart from those, you have just a bunch of people coming together for an objective. Basically, everyone wants something, and these are colliding stories. Basically, they're just colliding atoms that causes friction and conflict. So you have to go into the story understanding, as Scott said at the start or before, that you have everyone sees themselves as not a villain. Evil doesn't really exist in your own mind as yourself unless you really do reflect on what your actions are, and not a lot of people have that self-reflection. So you tend to, it's like there's a paper, like a psychology paper called "Normal People Are Evil," which is a theory or a proof trying to say that every person every day does something evil because they're acting in selfish ways. Even buying a coffee at Starbucks, that £3 could have went to a homeless guy down the road, for example. Just doing these small things are villainous acts almost, because you're not doing the good you could. You're not stretching yourself that bit further into that good Samaritan and becoming that, selfless person. And it's that's what like villains really are. They're just taking that a little bit further. They're just the people who are more indulgent in their own selfishness, basically.
And I think you're also quite right that you don't need an external villain. I've certainly run any number of convention games that follow the mode of blood opera, where what drives them is the antagonism between the player characters.
Yeah.
That you have a group of people with wildly differing agendas who are in this situation together, who have got reasons to work together, reasons not to work together, and there is some perhaps external pressure that is bringing these agendas to the forefront that is causing them to come more and more into conflict, and you just keep that pressure up until the whole thing explodes. That's clearly not a type of game that everyone's going to enjoy. There are some people who absolutely hate player versus player play in a game, and that's entirely fine. But I absolutely love convention games like that.
Yeah, I almost think cooperative games are more antagonistic than PvP games, because when you're trying to cooperate and someone's not doing something you want them to do for that greater good, you become conflicted with that player and it becomes a rub, but you can't really do anything about it because there's the rub and you're compelled with cooperation. So everyone just becomes grumpy with each other because you can't really act out. And if you have a group which you trust, PvP is perfectly fine.
I'd say just. Yeah. I think because it's a word that's been mentioned a few times now, and I've written down the name of that psychology paper, Graeme, because I want to try and find it and have a look at it. I come to these things to take notes. But I think if, like Scott says, if you're on a table with people, whether you're keeping or playing, where people are happy with player versus player, even though from the keeper to the players, you can have that psychological aspect in that game, but as soon as you lean into what Graham's also talking about there, you can really invest in that psychological, either cooperative, someone does something that isn't there. There's a whole psychological kind of unspoken game that begins to play out then between the players. And if the players enjoy that, which I'm a player that enjoys that, if the players enjoy that kind of game, it can be so rewarding, because obviously outwardly everyone's trying to do the same thing cooperatively, as Graeme I think called it, those atoms that are thrust together but also have their own kind of drives but want the same thing, but they're all buzzing for their own individual needs. And that psychology that comes across as you get to play can be so much fun and so rewarding.
You could go, sorry, John.
Oh no, go ahead, Grant, please.
I was going to say you can make accidental villains as well doing that sort of thing, because if you have NPCs you're just always shitting on all the time, and then the power dynamics shifts and you need their help for once, and they're just like holding the keys and nah, I'm good, I'm good over here, and you just watch them walk away from you like in a dire straits. These are the things which are really memorable. That betrayal, that really I didn't really think about what I was doing to that person until now. But yeah,
when the Bellkeep becomes the most important person in the entire campaign because they never tipped him.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I was going to say the Alien RPG kind of has this a little bit built in. They at least give you the tools, but it's up to the players to use them. In which they have buddies and rivals on all of the characters' player sheets, and so as Scott mentioned earlier, Scott was a player in a Chariot of the Gods scenario that I ran with the How We Roll crew, and there were no scripted villains per se in the scenario. It's just the alien monsters, and it's it's built as a survival horror game, but we had villains and conflict. We had the blood opera, and a lot of it came from the fact that just due to the IP and people's experience in seeing the movies, and Scott being an amazing company man, people were just like, nope, don't trust the company man. And Scott was amazing because he was always focused on his goal, which was for the good of the company. Let's just do this. Those are acceptable losses. I can't remember how many times I've heard acceptable losses, and it was fantastic. It was just utterly amazing on how that kind of player versus player conflict was rising, and at the same time they're all going, the ship is going to blow up unless we do these things, and so they trying to achieve the other goals in the scenario as well. So that came across very well.
Camille was great in that because it was like every time there was an existential threat that was coming up, it was, but all right, we're going to deal with that, but I've got to kill Scott's character first.
Oh yeah. And she was so demeaning. There was never any authority in addressing him as the company man. He was just John, right? John will take care of that. We'll take care of John for sure. So.
For one-shots, I would definitely suggest looking at Bluebeard's Bride as an example, because Bluebeard in that is technically the antagonist, but you never encounter him. He's always off screen, and the player characters are dealing with what he's actually done and their relationship to him. And then they can, as they explore all these terrible incidents, they will eventually decide, am I actually going to go with this person, disobey this person, or become my own person?
Mm-hmm.
But again, Bluebeard, you never see him. Sorry.
Another RPG I'd recommend if you're interested in exploring dynamics like that, I'll mention it because it's coming back into print, is Hot War and Cold City, which is a companion game, which are these games that Malcolm Craig wrote a while back, which are, Cold City is set in Berlin during just before the erection of the wall, and it's Berlin under the control of the Allies, divided up into different sectors, but with some weird mad science thrown in. And then Hot War is this post-apocalyptic game set in 1960s England. But the dynamic that makes them both interesting is that the player characters in each one are members of the same organization, but they're members that have been drawn in from rival or opposing factions who have to work together for a greater good. And so each one of them has their own faction agendas that perhaps push them away from any shared agendas. And then on top of that, each one has a personal agenda, which is sometimes at odds with their faction agenda, and is almost certainly at odds with someone else's personal agenda, and certainly at odds with the greater mission. And so just from the time you start play, the whole thing is one glorious clusterfuck of conflicting agendas. And as a GM, if you set all this up right, either working with the players to set all those agendas up, or with pre-gens that are designed to be a powder keg, you just have to sit back and watch as everything implodes. It's great.
There's another interesting question from the audience. which is do the actions of a villain define whether or not they are compelling?
I mean, if the actions are compelling, I mean, it's at least entertaining. It would be more entertaining if they're compelling, I would think.
Yeah.
And in a game setting, the more compelling is the more inviting to draw in the players for conflict.
Yeah, I mean,
and also, sorry,
go on. Go on.
No, I was just very quickly going to say, and also, I mean, just from a purely, I'm not sure how else the players would get to know the villains except through their actions. So I think that that pretty much defines it.
Yeah, I was going to say, if it's not through their actions, they're not really a villain. They become someone they like, basically. Because if they're known for their personality, then they're just a personality. It's only through crossing that social contract again into something which the players perceive as evil or wrong in some way, is like they become that villain. And again, it depends on how much they cross that line, whether they're just a affable rogue who might steal an apple off a stand, or someone who's going to commit mass genocide. But one leads to the other, obviously, in a lot of games. So, yeah. But everything's the hooks, and I mean, every character in a story has hooks, and these hooks are stakes, and everyone has a break point as well when that stake is too much for the actual goal objective they're trying to go for as well. Generally, the antagonist or compelling, that action has to cross that barrier, even so they're willing to sacrifice more for anyone else. They're more, I'd say they're probably more committed to getting it than anyone else, and it's up to the players to become even more committed in what they're willing to sacrifice. And that's a lot of problems with hooks actually in a lot of games, because they'll give you a hook at the start and they'll push you forward, but that hook slowly becomes less valuable than the actual consequences of following that hook. So the players back out or feel like the character should back out, and it's only the players, like, it's a game nature pushing them forward rather than the actual stakes of the character. So the villain is kind of the same as that. He just doesn't have any moral problem crossing more and more lines to get to his goal. And they're all actions. If he didn't cross any lines, he would be that antagonist.
That's a good one.
I think that actions kind of goes, for all NPCs, and I suppose if we're in regard to, does it make them compelling? Is that in regard to they're compelling as a villain to the player character, or is it as a player separate to the game? Am I going, oh yeah, they're bloody wicked villain, they're really, I suppose there's a slight difference there as well, as that, outside of the game I'm going, this villain is absolutely next level. Inside of the game, I suppose they are intrinsically linked to a degree, aren't they? Because obviously your experience as the player then is your experience, as your character as well. But I think those actions, it's going to involve everything, isn't it, that we've talked about so far. It's going to talk about action, inaction, motives, relationships, conversations, things that do happen, don't happen, any kind of interaction. It could be the look from someone across the room to the other side of the room, as long as it carries meaning, as long as it carries a purpose to further the shared narrative that's happening. I think it is going to inform them as a compelling character. But I think Graham's right, it's not just the villain. This goes for everybody that's in the game, because they all play, they're all a piece in the grand puzzle, aren't they?
Yeah, I remember playing Walking Dead with you, Newman. That one was interesting, because I did think the bad guys were very compelling, because you don't really get to see them too much. They do cross some lines, but you only get there at the end, and it's kind of a bit of a slog sort of thing.
I remember with that, you running a game that, when this is what we talked about earlier, that there was a huge psychological aspect to it, because like Scott and John were talking about earlier, the characters had these hooks. I think they were really good hooks as well, for the way we played them as well, the way you ran them. But I think it was those hooks in our player group with the outside threat of not just zombies, but also the other the NPCs
alphas,
that were in it, the alphas. Yeah, it very much it created the pressure cooker of we've got to make some choices here, and this is where the psychology comes in with the hooks of the game.
For sure.
Yeah,
it was all
yeah.
player driven.
Yeah,
for sure.
And your villain needs to reflect the themes that you want to explore in your narrative. Otherwise, they're just there. But if you can have the villain's actions or the result of their actions weave into that narrative and have the player characters get invested into those results and interacting with those results, I think that's where it can be compelling. Even like I said, if you can maybe not even meet the villain, but just basically dealing with what they've done and repairing that, maybe even seeing that there is some truth to what they've done. A villain that's right, but they've done horrible things to get their success. That's actually a lot more deep and resonant with a player, because where does your line go, and where will you cross it? And I think that's a more compelling narrative.
Yeah, a scenario that kind of pops in my mind when you're talking about that is Oakwood Heights. Is it the cult scenario? The sort of scenario? It's basically, it's not even really finding much out. You're basically walking through someone's crime scene that they've already admitted to doing. It's very different. It struck with me because it was a very different way of looking at an investigation. You have all of the pieces, you just don't know why, and you're trying to have this last-ditch effort of finding out why this killer did these horrific things that he did. And I found that incredibly compelling. And then at the end, you have to even question yourself, basically, and your own motives of what you're doing and how. So it's a very strong scenario for that reason. It's front-loaded with information. I think that's its only sort of a hard point. It's like you have to go through this case file, but I think that could be handled even before the game. Just hand them a dossier to the player, say this is your case file, and just take that out of the game and put it pre-game, sort of thing. So it's a very strong scenario in my opinion. But going back to the making their actions compelling, set pieces are something which is probably what you want to work on to really sell the antagonist then, if you want to make it stronger. The film 7, you never really see the antagonist at all, even though you meet him twice, I think, in the film before that.
Yeah.
You see his work and you see what he's capable of, and you have to basically, again, just go through these horrific aftermaths of this character who's just terrorizing. I said he becomes that looming threat. Again, you don't see him until the very, very end.
Do you even see him commit any? I mean, obviously he commits the acts, and we, as you say, we see the set pieces. But do we actually see him, John Doe, commit anything? I don't know if we do. I can't remember if we do.
No,
I'm not convinced we do.
I don't think so.
No, only I guess Wrath at the end.
Yeah.
But he does. He just telling him pull. He's not actually doing anything. He's just
exactly.
talking.
Yeah.
It's the most meek form of antagonist could do. But
And
yeah,
even when he does attack, the two of them in that hallway, he's always a silhouette. He's just basically a cutout figure.
Yeah.
He's a looming threat. Yeah. It's a very good film, and that's how you want to build campaigns, I guess, as well. You want to have that sort of mystery and the jigsaw pieces of all these crime scenes, and kind of to fit them together and let the players come up with their own conclusions. Don't really lead them by the nose.
But as a counterpoint to what you just said there, Graeme, as well as the set pieces, I think, depending on the kind of GM you are and the kind of game you're running, a lot of games, I think, it might be difficult to shoehorn set pieces in. They're sometimes a bit more dynamic and freeform. In which case, I think another important aspect, as sort of the flip side of that, is to look for opportunities or ways of bringing that antagonism into conflict with that antagonist rather, into conflict with the player characters. Look for scenes where the player characters are trying to achieve something that perhaps you hadn't even anticipated, and sort of think, right, if the antagonist gets wind of this, or if they're involved with it somehow, how can they stymie this somehow?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point. Too much of one thing's always a bad thing. If you have set piece after set piece after set piece, that's like a gag film. It's like it's almost a comedy. It becomes sketches almost, and it's not what you really want. What I mean by set piece is just have this like one scene, which even if the players aren't there, they hear about and they can visit perhaps in the aftermath. It's again, the plot always runs in the background of the player's story, so things are moving behind the scene. If they don't go to a certain place, that's fine. You just change it into the aftermath of that scene, and it becomes a different type of thing, and you trade mystery for suspense sort of thing, or suspense for mystery. If they miss if they're waiting for something to happen and they miss it, the suspense of that thing happening. If they miss it and then they've got to investigate what happened afterwards, it becomes a mystery, and vice versa. It just switches around. But yeah, dynamic storytelling, you need to do whatever the players want you to do, really.
I think we touched on this before, but I think now with the individual covered, and we touched a bit with corporations and aliens and stuff, what would you say, how do you handle multiple villains when one is not enough, and you introduce not only a strong antagonist to the players, but for example, entities as well, or monsters then ultimately?
I'm terrible for introducing far too many NPCs and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I love having multiple antagonists in the game.
Yeah.
This is a mild spoiler, but it's a very mild one. There's a campaign I co-wrote with Paul Fricker and Matt Sanderson called The Two-Headed Serpent, and a lot of the dynamic about that is that there are multiple antagonists, and that the player characters uncovered different antagonists at different stages, and they've all got similar but conflicting agendas, and they're all at each other's throats. And I just had a lot of fun, both in the writing and GMing that, with that dynamic of these quite often incompetent antagonists wrecking each other's plans, and the PCs just in the middle of it all being in a position to capitalize on this. Which I think is, as a player, quite a fun situation to be in.
Newman kind of mentioned this earlier, but I like taking my multiple villains and mirroring them rather than mirroring just against the PCs, mirroring the villains against each other with Blood Dipped Wings, which is an actual play that it's going to be coming up. My antagonists, the whole story kind of explores the trauma of violence. So I have the jackals against what are called the war dogs, and the war dogs they belong to the Archon Netzach. Their version of violence is everything has to be a victory. It has to be clean and cut and perfect. Whereas the jackals, they just delight in violence. They just drink it up. So it's like you've got the lawful versus the chaotic, and the players are in between, trying to see which side that they can actually deal with.
I think building on what Jason's saying there, and I think, or you've made me think, Jason. I think when I'm writing and when I'm keepering as well, or playing or GMing, I think with villains, I very much like to have a voice, and even if I'm writing the character, I tend to, and I'm sure this is something that someone's going to cringe at, or hopefully go, oh yeah, me too. So sometimes I kind of associate, and this is probably just my background, I associate like an actor with that person because I can kind of hear their voice in that specific way. One that I used recently, and I'm still writing up, Charles Dance. It just so happens I taught their granddaughter and told their granddaughter to tell Charles Dance that I love him, and apparently they did. But as such, I think we are, and I saw it. I also looked at someone's question on YouTube as well, talking about looking at movies and RPGs and people that we love. I think we have, not just in our writings, and we do have it within our writings, of course we do, but we have such a wealth of brilliant villains that we can kind of go to and look at traits and tricks, and even the way people speak or the way they move and look and interact. And I just there's something about finding that really kind of beautiful moment with the villain that you kind of go, that's the thing I really want to express, but I want to do it in this way or this environment or this this interaction. And I think it's taking that, something that has been done so beautifully and so well and has profoundly kind of impacted you probably. And if any of you guys are like me, you've probably watched your films growing up going, I'm more interested in the villain. Then you get to the point where you go, oh, I want to have a go at playing with that idea, and that's what ends up in the campaign. But then, like John said very much earlier in this conversation, it's making sure that can translate in to the keeper or the GM. This is what they want, this is how they're going to do it, but also here's the flavor of the character. If we can communicate that as well, here's the flavor of the villain to play with and have fun with. That's quite a powerful thing to do.
Yeah, I love Charles Dance too. I'll put that out there.
Is there anyone who doesn't?
Exactly.
If so, they're wrong.
Yeah, exactly. And touching on film, multiple villains can also be, Scott mentioned that they can be in conflict with each other, but with similar agendas, and so maybe there's a shaky alliance with them. But also, multiple villains can be aligned with the movie. We all assume that Kiefer Sutherland is the villain. He's the leader of the gang of Lost Boys, and there's where the conflict is. And it isn't until he's been defeated that his boss comes out and says, no, I'm the villain. And he's a really effective villain, because all of his boys have just been destroyed and he doesn't really seem to care. All he cares about is starting a new gang, right? And getting that new family created. But you can layer your villains so that they are aligned and just kind of hierarchical. But if you're going to go with that method, you need to make sure that you're not presenting them in game simultaneously, right? You want to try and serialize them, because then you still maintain the surprise. Like, oh, you defeated this one, but here's his boss, right? Here he was pulling the strings actually. But if you show them at the same time, then it's just you're just ganging up on the players. But maybe that might be what you want to do. But
John, thank you for actually answering the question, which I didn't answer at all. But just that was what I was trying to say, but then forgot because I got carried away with Charles Dance. Was you have one in my head? I mean, I'm gonna I'm gonna go get my Charles Dance collection out later. You've got someone like that in your mind. You've got this idea of how you can play it. For me, as advice, especially to any new GMs or keepers or anything, being able to visualize as someone running the game, this is what this villain is like, and then having someone completely different, someone like Timothy Spall or something, who's on a completely different end of the scale, the way they would talk, move, think, it's going to really help, I think, communicate those different villainous qualities, especially if you are looking at a complex multi-villain story, or even not even villains, just multi NPC story that have differing aspects of morality, etc. Being able to really differentiate them and do that within your storytelling, that was the thing. Thank you, John. Sorry.
A good mechanic that you might want to borrow for that is from Night Black Agents, the Conspirapid.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, you literally build a pyramid of the villains and who controls who and what their different motivations are. And it's for a long-term campaign, but the more the player characters pull at the threads, the more that they can actually see how everything is interwoven.
And I think there's something that's related to what John was saying as well that sort of ties in as well with the pyramid, which is misguided people and idiots and so on. If you've got an antagonist who's a manipulator or has high social status, then you're probably going to find the player characters are in conflict with the authorities and other members of society and so on, who believe the antagonist, who trust them, who may not see them for the villain they are, but sees the respectable side of them. And so then the very power structures and the people who should be supporting the player characters end up becoming their antagonists as well, just because the social dynamics.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I was going to say as well. Basically,
Oh,
proxy.
sorry.
Oh, it's fairly obvious. It's all right. Yeah, it's proxies for the sort of villainous organization. It's like they can become friends, very good friends and dear friends of the player characters, and that's the ones that are going to hurt the most. Again, if you want to twist that knife. So if you have that real idiot who's like ground floor villain organization, he can basically be the in and the out for the player. So they could just casually mention who they are to the boss by mistake, things like that. But this is where it comes down to, like, it's an organization doing a thing, but none of the moving parts really care about the overall goal. They're just trying to live their own life with their own small petty problems that they want to solve, and it's like they don't give a shit about what the upper management are doing, really, unless they get an inkling, and maybe they'll have a change of heart as well, and you could maybe have a redemption arc or something like that for one of these NPCs, and you can actually go the other way and redeem one of these sort of NPCs.
And I guess that also presents another kind of related dynamic, which is where you do have organizations or conspiracies that there might be different factions within them that involved in power struggles or subtly different agendas, which again present potential places where pieces can drive wedges.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about conflict and making sure you exploit what you can, basically.
Mm-hmm. And like Graeme said, we're all each antagonist is the hero in their own head. They're going to take actions that they believe are just, and those just actions might be absolutely horrible and affect the people that are around them. And then that resonates down.
Yeah, not even just actions. It could be selfish ones, just they think it's not going to cause any problems or not going to have any sort of knock-on effect. I mean, going back to that social contract again, we're like constrained by our society around us, our laws and all the rest of it. We don't do certain things because we know they're morally wrong, but it's the consequence of law which will really stop us doing it. If someone can think they can get away with something, most of the time they'll try to. If they don't think it's going to be, if they think it's going to be a victimless crime or something like that, it's more compelling for them just to take that extra biscuit off the table, sort of thing. And that's where a lot of these things come from. They think they'll better themselves, and no one's going to get hurt from it. But sometimes that can have a massive cascade.
It's the aggregation of all those.
Yeah.
Sorry, Newman.
Yeah, no. I was just Graham's biscuit metaphor. I was just saying it's the aggregation of marginal gains, isn't it? It starts off as a biscuit. Next week it's 3 packets of biscuits, and then it's Nakatomi Plaza, isn't it? It's it's that time of year. I think we're getting there.
I was thinking with the whole multi-villain layers and having being in conflict with authorities and stuff. It made me think of Gus Fring from Breaking Bad. The police love Gus. Well, why do they love him? Because he donates money and he helps support their organization. I mean, people get blinded and they will assume goodness in others if they have somehow benefited from it, and that's why the police will look last at Gus. It isn't until someone starts really pulling on those strings and showing the coincidences that they're going, maybe he isn't a good guy. I mean, it takes that revelation and that spotlight, and in game that may be something that the players could do, right? If you're in conflict with the authorities because they're supporting the villain, they're only supporting the villain because they are benefiting from it. And if the players can show that spotlight on ferreting out, how does that villain, have leverage over the good guy, over the authorities, maybe that could be the piece that could be broken, right? And you can start changing the dynamics. Not always possible, but it's there.
And Gus in that the Gus Fring character, and I know there's probably equivalents in so many series, in that fictional authoritative capacity, he's kind of perceived as an acceptable villain as well by society. There's the acceptance of we probably do know what is it? Las Polis Locus is the chicken joint, whatever it's called. We probably know what he's up to. That's it. Thank you. But we're accepting it because of XYZ, which is also quite a scary thing for players to come up against, isn't it? Is to come up with someone that it's known perhaps that they are nefarious. It's known perhaps that they are villainous in whatever capacity, but it's accepted by people with power, as Scott was talking about earlier, with the society within the game. If it's accepted by those and even kind of ignored, then the players have got a real kind of moral quandary as to how they would even navigate that.
Yeah.
Well, I think as well, I mean, Breaking Bad is a fantastic series to analyze if you're looking at different types of villain, because you've got a huge spectrum there from the sort of societally acceptable villains like Gus Fring, who keep order and stop the more dangerous individuals in their business from perhaps inflicting too much collateral damage, but do plenty of harm themselves, to ones who are just animalistic killers, to ones who are just so-called professionals like Mike, who will isn't necessarily evil, but is just a pure pragmatist who will do what he's paid to do, no matter how horrible it is, to the self-deluding kind like Walt, who believes he's the hero of the story, and until he's forced to confront the fact that he's actually the villain.
Yeah, I mean, Hank's probably the closest you get to a good character in that. He's suspect to a lot of sort of problems.
Yeah.
And he's also effectively the antagonist, so it is a classic dynamic of what I was talking about earlier, where the antagonist is the one with the sympathetic motivation. He's the good guy in the story. It's just that we've been rooting for someone who is really the villain of the story.
Yeah, it's a good fall arc, and you do end up finding out that you've been doing even as a viewer, you've been thinking the wrong things basically.
Taking me down memory lane here. I've got Sopranos running through my head. The idea that the entire cast are all villains. But but there's that, as you said, and I think we're talking about that. What was it, Jason? The Night's Black Agents, the pyramid of villainy, the who's at the top and stuff. And then I think Scott, you were saying as well about that kind of that different type. I remember in season 2, I can't remember his name, but he was like the brother-in-law, and he was like really edgy and spiky and constantly making Tony like react, but just brilliant because they're all bad guys. But such compelling characters.
And when we got law enforcement in that, they're presented as antagonists, even though they are ultimately doing the right thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I think since we're going towards the end, if there are more questions from the audience, please ask them away. But there's one part of the title that we haven't even touched on. That's the monster part. Although monster can be seen quite broadly, as we all know that humans are capable of becoming monsters. But I think we're seeing this more in a monstrosity way. And there's a good question, actually. Designing villains and designing monsters. What's the difference in thinking and approach?
I mean, villains inherently have motivations. They have goals. And monsters normally have instincts. They're going to go with whatever comes natural to them. Primarily survival, food, replication, that kind of thing, which is a xenomorph, right? I mean, but yeah, for me, the main difference is that villains have a goal, they have an agenda, and they want to achieve that because they're trying to build something. And this goal that you're working on, that just may be the first building block. Once they achieve that, then they're going to have the next goal. Then they'll have the next goal. I mean, they want to continue to grow, where monsters don't necessarily look to have change or growth. Dragons might want to accumulate loot, but beyond that, they're just still, trying to survive. And then, if just to take an aside, if I can, I wanted to pimp this book, Writing Monsters by Philip Athens. I love this book. It was a fast and very entertaining read, and it's fantastic, and you can find it on Amazon. But I get nothing for that, but that's all right. But I loved it. It was a great read, and it really taught me a lot, and motivated me to do more writing, to create more monsters. So yeah, check it out.
I think just building on John's thing there, and Basil in the chat's mentioned it as well, is about the intelligence of the monster. Because we could be talking about something that doesn't have an intelligence, much like it's so animalistic and instinctual and primal, or it could be something where their intelligence is so rapidly far beyond anything we could comprehend. There's almost a similarity in a lack of understanding. But then also you can have monsters, and I think this is something that we do. And I know when I wrote, it was my second scenario, so quite early in my writing. But when I wrote Secret Santa, spoiler alert. Krampus is in it, but because there are certain human understandings of Krampus, the mythology behind it, the story behind it, there are certain qualities ingrained in that are human qualities. So I don't think it was writing a monster in the truest sense of writing a monster, because there was still an element of humanized understanding of that character. But I think writing a monster that is so beyond that's the trick, especially for any new game masters or keepers, is communicating that lack of humanity in their intentions, which can be hard to understand. But I think the understanding of we can't understand it is probably a good step in the right direction. But that's a big scale that I'm talking about there.
Well, I think with Call of Cthulhu in particular, that line between villains or antagonists and monsters is a pretty murky one with a lot of the entities of the mythos, because you have creatures like the Migo and the Yithians and Deep Ones and the Elder Things and so on, which operate at a human scale and have human or slightly higher than human intelligence, and in a lot of cases have motivations that are perhaps somewhat alien to us, but not entirely alien, that they're motivated by seeking knowledge. They want to archive information. They want to understand us. They want to harvest resources. They want to reproduce. All the same things that humanity does. The conflict tends to come from the fact that they're just not like us. And in that respect, when I use them in games, in fact, ghouls are another great example there. I tend to put them in conflict with humanity just because they have, as a group or individuals, the same kind of goals that were bringing them into conflict with the player characters as human antagonists would. It's just that their presentation and their methods and some of the things that they have access to are perhaps scarier and weirder.
And they can be both. If I can jump in real quick, when you're doing a scenario and you have ghouls in there, because they do have human intelligence, and some of them were human at one point prior, but in a scenario, it will It's been my experience that if you were to try and make every individual ghoul, because they do, by stats of the book, have human level intelligence, if you were to try and make every individual one of them and then has motivations and whatever, it's too much to control. But if you have a group of ghouls and you say these 4 are the soldiers, they're the mooks, then that's a hive mind. You can just group them and they fall under the monster category. But then you've got this other ghoul off to the side, this 5th one, and he's more of a scientist, right? He's the thinker, or he's the sergeant or the lieutenant. That's the one that might fall into a villain antagonist category, because you're going to put more efforts in having that one ghoul make decisions and have intelligent reactions to the PC's actions versus the 4 soldier mooks who are just there to fight and die. So you can have both, even in the same species of creature. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Jason.
Oh, no. Just basically, when I usually design monsters, I kind of go thematically, and monsters are metaphor. Basically, they represent something in the narrative. Yeah. There's generally like 5 archetypes. For example, the Harbinger, which is basically representing our existential dreads. That would be like Cthulhu and or Nyarlathotep. We can't understand its motivations, but the fear that it represents is that we don't understand the universe, and when we are faced by the universe, our sanity and our beliefs come into question. Or the Devourer, which is basically thematically passions. So that would be like the vampire, where we want to actually devour the other person and let our passions out without constraints. Or the outsider, which would be like the werewolf, where basically that person is now outside of society. And it's not just that they're a monster, they're pushed away. That's where the fear is that we don't want them. They have to live outside of our society. And that's where the fear is. So if you can take those different kind of archetypes and then weave them into your narrative, that's where your monster becomes more ingrained into the story and more important, at least in my mind.
Yeah.
You just reminded me of a game. It's an unpublished game, but I think it's still available online, that Vincent Baker did. Vincent Baker, who was responsible for Apocalypse World and many other fine games. A game called Afraid, which was from about 15 years ago. And it's about monsters and fighting monsters, and he goes through a process, a very regimented process for creating a monster for each scenario, and a lot of it is choosing those archetypes and then choosing the process. I think in it, all the monsters used to be human at some stage in the process whereby they became a monster, and what that monster's archetype and motivations are, the kind of danger they present. And I think, the game itself, I seem to remember, was actually fairly unplayable mechanically. That little bit of it is absolute gold, and if you can still find it online, it might be very, very inspirational.
Yeah, I think that goes back to even to when things are written, like when monsters are, like classic monsters are written, it's like they're always based on like a societal fear that's going around. And there's even a conspiracy about vampires and the rise of vampire and zombie movies in the US. They coincide with the rise and fall of the Democrats and the Republican Party. So when zombies are popular, the Republicans tend to come to power because it's meant to represent the fear of the masses, the fear of the unknown people they can't associate with. And the opposite is true with the Democrats, with the vampires being the elites, the people who suck the blood out of society and prey on society as well. And these things, I'm not sure how well it holds up, but it does hold up somewhat. I think it's very interesting going into that dynamic of like making monsters on your fears, or at least society worries of the time. And I think that's mostly where monsters come from. They are representations of things we sort of like fear will happen. That sort of dread almost as well. Going back to ghouls, I wrote a scenario called Autopsy, which is basically a university for ghouls, and you're the player characters that are basically put into this high-end university, and the ghouls are there to convince you what they're doing is right and walk you down a path of initiation into their cult. And they've got three passive philosophies, and it's like all the ghouls are kind of betting on them, on what path you'll take down into the final sort of area, where and it starts off with you're presented with a body's been found on campus, and they want you to look into it and see if there's anything you can find within the student body, ask some questions, and look in and see if you can finger a suspect for the police coming in the morning. And that guy who's on the autopsy table is basically the zombie will walk in and they'll be forced to eat at the end. So it's like going full circle.
Oh, nice.
So yeah, I like to. Yeah, I guess it's keeping that in with the fear of the people, and really kind of tying it into humanity, because all monsters are perceived by humans or us. So even though they're unfathomable and they work on maybe a different hierarchy of needs, they're still viewed from the lens of a human. So we can still put our own motives on them, even if it is wrong.
Vampires and werewolves in politics, it explains why silver crosses are always sold out at Walmart.
As Graeme was saying, and I don't want to get into it because I know there's going to be another a session that discusses subgenres, but yeah, it's monsters and horror being a transgressive medium. It likes to explore societal fears, and monsters represent our societal fears. For example, the 80s, the tumult of just post-Vietnam, recessions, the punk movement. That's how the splatterpunk movement came out, and those monsters came into existence because people, a lot of horror writers, then were looking at the previous generation of how is a ghost going to how can that just represent the horrors that I'm looking out my window these days? It just doesn't jive anymore. We need something more extreme.
Well, and I think the same thing is true of Lovecraft and the rise of cosmic horror in the 1920s, in that it was about the death of the Gothic and traditional horrors and horrors rooted in superstition, and seeking out horror that was rooted more in modernism and a reaction to modernism.
Well, he liked science a lot, didn't he? And he looked to science and even space exploration sort of thing. So you can see that moving forward, that influence is good. But yeah.
But he also rejected modernism as a cultural movement and saw a lot of fear in that, and that's reflected in cosmic horror too. This fear that greater understanding perhaps equals greater danger.
Yeah, I think the conflicting things were what made it so good. He was like struggling with his own sort of like thoughts, basically.
Mankind discovered a ninth planet in our solar system, and it became the source of a alien race. To put our brains in jars. So
it took me a while to come up with the name of the scenario, but it's from the scenario book that Scott, you actually contributed, Things We Leave Behind, Intimate Encounters by Oscar Rios, which I recently ran, and I think actually is a good mash between a monster and a villain in its say, because as or this entity that the investigators will encounter has a driven motivation with clear goals. It needs to acquire certain steps, and it's hyper intelligent, but at the same time it is able to do absolute destruction. So I really enjoyed that scenario, and I'm just processing all the discussions all the points that we talked about today, and actually realize that this is a well thought through scenario if you want a kind of a mix between a monster and a villain. I think Intimate Encounters by Oscar Rios is a fantastic little scenario that you can choose from.
Nice. Oh, even going back to The Sopranos, I mean, Ralphie's meant to be the actual devil.
Ralphie!
Ralphie.
That was who? That was the guy. Thank you,
Yes.
Graham. God, he did, didn't he? Didn't he just boil your blood as a viewer as well as
Yeah.
Brilliant performance. Thank you, Graham.
I think he was meant to be. It's like there's lots of literal symbolism in that show.
Yeah.
But I think that's touches upon another interesting type of villain, which is one that's just irritating as an antagonist. I mean, it doesn't have to pose an existential threat. It doesn't have to have master plans or anything like that. It just has to piss the players off. Going back to the meat trade, which I played with you, Graeme, Alfie. Was. I mean, I just threw in this NPC at some stage. I was asked to create an NPC on the spot, so I did so, and I just created another member of this gang that Cup's character was involved with, who just didn't like Cup's character. He was a fairly smart. He was a fairly smart guy who realized that Cup's character was just a bullshitter. Who, he had a very high fast talk skill and was a compulsive liar. And Alfie was one of the rare people in the gang who actually saw through this. And basically, any time Cup's character did something, he'd call him out on it or challenge him or try to stop him. And it just became this escalation of pettiness. I mean, he never posed an existential danger to the characters, but dear God, I think every time Cup encountered him, he just watched to kill him.
It was very funny watching him try to deal or navigate. He relied on. We all relied on fast talk a lot, to be honest. But without that sort of like shield of that veil of being able to bullshit, it was very funny to see Cup struggle. But I love. That was a good character.
Helps to have the microphone on. I think from the audience, as we are reaching the end, if you have any last-minute question, please ask them now. Otherwise, I think we've reached the end for this panel, unfortunately already, but definitely a fun and inspiring discussion as always. And kind of as a end note that I want to ask each of you is if you can give maybe inspiring writers, GMs, some sort of tip about either where you can get a good reference for villains or when they create villains or entities, or if there's some tips on what to look out for when creating those from your personal experience.
I guess my one tip would be perhaps don't even start off thinking about the villain or the antagonist or the monster. Think about the scenario that you're trying to write and the kind of conflict that you want the player characters to face during that scenario. What the conflict that drives the scenario is. And then the antagonist is really the personification, the face of that. And that, the nature of that conflict then informs who or what that antagonist is.
Yeah, that's really good advice. You can, starting with that conflict, you can also blend some of your favorite villains, right? You can and look across spectrum, right? So look at someone who's a human criminal mastermind, and a supernatural creature with abilities that are inhuman, and anything else, right? And just cherry pick and just like maybe a little of this and maybe a little of that, and then working towards a certain goal, and you can build something really interesting and unique.
build build your villain like a PC in some ways. Give them motivations, make them real. And when you're playing them, I would say make one quirk or something that reveals their actual character. I think one of the best portrayals of an eldritch creature was done by Bill Skarsgård with It. He would basically, it is a creature that is pretending to be human, and when he was acting, halfway through a sentence, he would just stop talking, creating that uncanny of effect, as if this creature has forgotten. Oh, yeah, I'm pretending to be something, and then it would start up that start talking again. That pause was absolutely terrifying, and he kept on using that. So beyond even when it became It, that was nothing compared to when it was just wearing that mask.
I think just building on what Jason's saying there about motives, the way I think about it is from my own training in as an actor. We often talk about in naturalistic acting the idea of having a super objective for the character, or in any play, in any film, in anything, and the super objective is what you're trying to achieve from the start of the play to the end of the play, or for as long as your character lives, or the scenario or the campaign. But to achieve that super objective, there are many objectives which you might pass and might fail, which then changes the nature of the character as you go forward. I think in what we're talking about, we've talked a lot about motives for villains. Having a absolute kind of ownership of what they want, it gives you a truth and an authenticity to play it, because you might not show it all the time, and you might lie about it, and that's okay, because that's might be what the villain does. Especially if they are duplicitous, two-faced, etc. But the reality of you as the GM knowing how to play that villain, what they want, what they're trying to achieve, what their super objective is at the end of all of these little objectives, all these little interactions they might have with or without the players, because they have their own life beyond the players. I think that authenticity will give your players a bit of a really good kind of bumper lane scenario to be able to work out what's going on, because you have played the truth, the authenticity of the villain. You haven't kind of flip-flop halfway through and gone, oh, actually, they're like this. Knowing the villain, especially if they're core to the actual narrative, the shared narrative, so important.
And I think related to that, I think you've got to be a champion for your villain. You've got to, at least at the time you're playing them, you've got to make yourself believe that they think they're the hero of the story. You've got to believe that they're the good guy here, and that that what they're doing is right.
Yeah, I think it always comes down to player judgment as well. How you present the player, or how you present the villain, and how the players perceive it, they always have a judgment call in their head of what they would have done in that situation. And if you do have them few moments where they said, well, yeah, I agree with that, then you have that more compelling sort of like hook to sort of interact and stuff like that. And yeah, it's all to do with motives, and that's the sort of like stakes are fractal. You can take a stake and make it very, very small, or you can make it very, very big, but it's all the same motivation which is driving that sort of ember of them moving forward to get that goal. But I think when it comes to villains as well, sometimes let them give something up, make them compromise themselves sometimes, and let the players get away with things. It introduces a little bit of hope to the players. They think, we can get the better of this guy. And that's the best kind of betrayal, when they think they can and they get so close, and then the villain obviously is a villain at the end of the day. So yeah, always shades of grey. Never be cartoonish with anything.
And your motivations don't need to be these grand schemes. I think that's one of the major mistakes with some writing, that they have these multi-layered motivations and plans and schemes. No, don't. One of my current villains is the God of the Highways. Its motivation is it's an eternal god. It's bored. It just wants to see people do terrible things to entertain it, because it's bored out of its mind.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think with that, I can probably just put in a little recommendation that I realized helped me a lot, shaping kind of the initial villain as well. Take a notebook while you're watching movies and just write down things about characters you see or read and what you find good about them, what you didn't like, and what parts you want to take. It's a short note might create the best villain in a scenario to come. And worst case, you have cliff notes for NPCs that you can quickly pull into your gameplay. So with that, I think I want to thank all of you, Graeme Patrick, John Hook, Tia Newman, Scott Dorward, and Jason Fryer for this invigorating and fantastic discussion about monsters and villains in the horror RPG setting and probably a bit beyond. So thank you very much, and for all the viewers submitting their questions. The next panel will commence shortly before midnight, or around, I think, in 4 hours. That's the easier way. From now on, where we are going to talk about the importance of setting an atmosphere in horror RPGs. And this will be with, again, Graeme Patrick, Tia Newman, John Hook, and Travis Lake. So it's going to be a night of interesting discussions, I think. And thank you all for watching. And for anybody else, I wish you a pleasant day, evening, and see you soon. Goodbye.
Take care.